Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for our final panel of the day, focusing on the future of innovation. I'm happy today to be joined with some great folks to be talking about the role that innovation plays in their everyday work. First, Usman Ahmed is the head of global public policy at PayPal. He's been there since 2015, although he spent time before that at eBay. And as many of you know, eBay split with PayPal, and Usman went over to PayPal at that point. He also serves as a Georgetown University professor for fintech law with our friend and my former predecessor, Dan Gorfine. I've had the wonderful joy of knowing Usman in both the industry and as a friend for many years, and excited to have him and share his views on this panel today. Also joining us is Nicole. She is the head of digital policy at Barclays in the UK, although today she's joining us from beautiful Spain. She's focused on fintech and regtech and working closely with global regulators in promoting their innovation and digital policy agenda. I've had the joy of getting to know Nicole over the past year, having first met her at our FinTech Forward conference last year, which was my first week on the job. So excited to hear what Nicole has to share today. And last but definitely not least, we have Banaz. Banaz is a senior policy counsel at Google. She's worked in DC since 1999, having worked in many law firms for the U.S. Trade Representative and on Capitol Hill. Banaz and I have gotten to know each other over the past year as she's pulled together a number of industry and government regulators to talk about the role of regulatory reporting in cloud. And so we'll be hearing a little bit about that later on today. So why don't we just delve right in? As I mentioned, the title of the panel is Financial Innovation. We've heard a lot about that today, whether it be innovation within industry and innovation within the government. How a number of people are developing innovation labs and trying to change the innovation mindset. But innovation mindset is already core to many of your companies. In some cases, it doesn't always start that way. And so can you talk a little bit about the innovation mindset at your company and how you're able to infuse that into your culture? Banaz, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me okay, Melissa?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, great. Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you very much, first of all, for having me on this panel, and thanks for the question. I think it's a really important one. I think that our journey with respect to innovation at Google has certainly been a very interesting one. I think, as you may know, Google started in 1998 as two guys with a great idea in a garage in Menlo Park, and the challenge for us has been really to sort of keep that innovative spirit and drive as we scaled from 2 to many hundreds of thousands of employees, and from 1 to many hundreds of products. And so whenever I hear Googlers talk about innovation, I hear three recurring themes. One is, sort of starting with a focus on and a real commitment to the user. Two is fostering expansive thinking. Sometimes you will hear this called sort of 10x thinking. And then three is creating space for experimentation, and really creating the ability to test and to validate, to kill ideas that don't work, to prototype ideas that do work, and then and continue enabling Googlers to sort of continue to search for better and better answers. That's sort of how we deal with innovation internally. I think what's really interesting, maybe more relevant for this audience, is when you get to my part of the business. I'm part of the cloud part of the business. It's not just about how we do innovation, but we are in the business of seeking to enable innovation on the part of our customers. And so, part of what we have to do is really look at how do we best support a culture of innovation there. And And you can see some real efforts to push in that direction in the products that we build. So I'll give you one sort of specific example, and I'll give you a more general one. So one specific example is this, is our collaboration software, Google Workspace. The notion that you have to have space for collaboration is sort of a key aspect of innovation culture. And when you look at how we think about collaboration software, it really isn't about just allowing people to have word processing tools or the ability to email one another. It's really to create space to allow for easy collaboration. And that was one of the most interesting things when I moved from government to Google was to see how that sort of difference in mindset as you looked at these tools. But it's more, it goes beyond collaboration software. Obviously, I think the entire sort of promise of cloud and cloud technology goes to that third element of allowing for experimentation and testing and validation and sometimes fast fail. The promise of cloud is that you can do some of those things without having to make a really heavy CapEx expenditure. You don't have to go out and buy a bunch of hardware in order to sort of test a new idea and see if it might work. And I think that is another really sort of key thing for our customers as they're looking to build their own innovation cultures.
Yeah, thanks. I love what you mentioned about government. We don't have that innovation mindset as easily, and that we can't launch and fail. It's a lot harder for us to do, but I love what you and the others on the panel bring to the table with that mindset. Usman, let's turn to you. We want to talk a little bit about the innovation mindset at PayPal.
Yeah, no, thank you, and thanks for the invitation to speak with you all today. I didn't coordinate with Ben-Oz before this, but I was actually going to take a historical view to this kind of question also, and kind of, PayPal also started about 20 years ago, and I think, the first lesson I feel like I draw from that history, where essentially the core product was, if you guys remember, it was really difficult to pay for anything that you bought online, sending a check in the mail or giving somebody your credit card information. And so kind of the core innovation or the core product was really this ability to both kind of pay online easily, but also pay online safely. And so what I derived from that history is that I think when we talk about innovation, we often think of the whole, move fast and break stuff. But it doesn't have to be that way, actually, that it can be both kind of innovation and security, innovation and compliance, innovation and, public or social good can actually go together. And so that kind of lesson from 20 years ago with a problem that, now today we kind of don't even think about. But essentially it was both a need for a faster or simpler process, which is what we often associate with innovation, but also a more secure process. And so I think it's important not to lose that part of innovation, that it actually has to be done in a way that protects people, that thinks about people's needs beyond just convenience. And then the second lesson, I guess, also to derive from our history, you mentioned kind of my, eBay owned PayPal, as you mentioned, so I kind of worked for eBay, but worked on PayPal. And then when PayPal spun off in 2015, it was actually fascinating because I felt like we were very much a, product, and technology-focused institution, and our new CEO came in and said, what is the point of all this innovation? And I think he asked that very poignant question of what are we trying to do here? And by, thinking about innovation in terms of how are you actually making people's lives better, what is the mission that you're trying to achieve, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? Sometimes when you go down the innovation rabbit hole, you kind of just get lost in the technology or kind of, what is the latest, coolest thing. But what was so important in 2015 was we said, okay, we're this huge online payments company, but there's millions and millions of people that don't have basic or decent financial services. And so what can we do to kind of help to solve that problem? And just by reorienting the innovation towards a meaningful societal goal, I think that was a very important shift in our kind of innovation mindset, was don't just engage in innovation for the sake of innovation, but to actually, in our case, improve people's financial health. But whatever the mission is or whatever the broader goal is, I think that's actually probably more important than what the technology is that's being used. So that's kind of the shift that I've seen in this company over the last, I've only been here 10 years, but let's say 20 years, of kind of our approach to the innovation mindset.
Yeah, I love that the mindset's not just focused on technology, it's focused on your underlying mission. And Nicole, let's turn to you. I think you bring a little different perspective. Obviously, innovation is core to what Barclays is doing, but it wasn't always that way. And so can you share a little bit about your experience in bringing an innovation mindset, but also changing a culture to include that?
Of course, and again, thank you for inviting me today. Yeah, it's a bit different for Barclays, because Barclays has existed for over 300 years. So it's not a company that's been around for 10 years or 20 years or even 30 years. And I actually genuinely like this question, because often when people talk to me about innovation at Barclays, they'll say, oh, maybe it was difficult in the past because, you've got legacy systems and that must be your biggest challenge. And I'm like, well, legacy systems exist for a lot of established players, but actually amongst the established players, it's legacy thinking that it has been a greater challenge, because changing culture takes a really long time. And it's not about just changing it at the senior level, because sometimes people go, no, it's at the senior level, you need to change this culture and you need to change the mindset. But it's not. It's across the whole institution, because sometimes you may find colleagues who may slightly fear technology and innovation because they think it's going to take their roles or their jobs. And, once people are more comfortable with it, they understand it better and they don't fear it so much. So I think that's one of the changes that we've seen. It's across the whole institution. Now, I personally think I'm very fortunate because Barclays is very innovation friendly. We have our RISE accelerator, we have our Eagle Labs, we have RISE accelerators in various jurisdictions. And it goes to what Usman was saying, it's starting from what is the problem you're trying to solve. Sometimes technology is the answer, sometimes it's not, but it's starting from being customer and investor centric at Barclays and working out from that. So one of the things that we do a lot of is both internal and external training and upskilling. We do internal training for our colleagues, but we also do external training for our external stakeholders and also for our customers and investors, because again, that goes to, it's not just about changing the mindset of your institution, it's about changing the mindset of those that operate and work with your institution. So I'd say that when I first started doing this, I probably had a distribution list of maybe 5 people. And now my distribution list is so long that I can't have it in the email chain. I have to have an actual separate loads of different distribution lists for different things, because otherwise if you're reading it on your iPhone, you wouldn't get to the email for a very long time. And I think that shows the difference. Before there weren't so many people working on this, and now so many people across the bank have to be focused on innovation, because I'm to be honest, if we weren't, in a number of years we would cease to exist. And that's one problem, but 2, it wouldn't help our customers and our investors if we weren't. So then if we're not customer and investor centric, really what's the point of us doing this job?
Yeah, that's a good point. And the role, and I love the, distribution list is long because everybody recognizes the role technology and innovation play. I think probably even more so this past year, as many of you know, that our first Empower Innovation event, we talked a little bit about technology and innovation in time of crisis. And what is happening. And obviously it's been a historic year. We've had to rethink how we work as regulators, had to rethink how we regulate, how we supervise. Many of us have had to think about how our kids go to school. I know each of you have experienced it both on a personal level, but also from a company perspective, the role that technology and innovation has done to help either you, your family, or, in the case of your companies, your customers and the employees during this time. Can you share a little bit about that experience and some of the stuff you've been doing or your companies have been doing in this space, and the role technology and innovation has done to help us get through this crisis? And Usman, let me start with you on this one.
Sure. So let's rewind, I guess, back to April when I think pandemic was raging in a few cities and really starting to spread across the country. And, experts on both the epidemiological and I think on the economic side realized that kind of the segment of our economy that was probably going to be the hardest hit were small businesses that were having to shut down both due to lockdowns and due to the fact that affluent people in particular were not going out to their local shops in order to buy things. And so Congress saw fit to kind of create this, as part of the CARES Act, the whole Paycheck Protection Program. And Congress also saw fit at that time to include fintechs, I think, as part of the recovery effort, which was a first of its kind. And so in terms of our participation and kind of our engagement with that, we had to stand up a whole new product. We had never engaged with the Small Business Administration for a lending program, and we had to kind of create an intake. We had to redesign our architecture that we had in our existing lending program to kind of take on the incredible demand that was going on at that time. And to your point about innovation mindset and just seeing that play out, I mean, being on calls at 2 a.m, and not because my newly born son was crying at that time, but because there were people who were just committed to trying to do what they could to help. I mean, there was no money to be made from this program, really. This was just about, can we save millions potentially of small businesses across the financial sector. And so, at PayPal, we had a small role. We did about $2 billion in loans, but I think what was unique and interesting was that we were able to kind of fill a gap in terms of, in particular, really small loans. Our average loan size was about $28,000, whereas in the full program, it was closer to $150,000. So, and then we released some research, which I could upload to the Wahova platform, of kind of demonstrating that these loans went to, disproportionately minority-owned businesses, areas that were kind of overlooked throughout the lending program. And so, I think just a number of lessons to draw from that kind of crisis in terms of the public sector really expanding and bringing in new players like PayPal and Intuit and others into the lending ecosystem, whereas they hadn't been there before, and really partnering to make sure that the smallest of businesses were able to to get some reprieve during this incredibly challenging time.
Yeah, that's a big sector of the economy that's been hit globally for sure. Behnaz, do you want to share a little bit about Google's experience over the past year? I will just say, seeing my kids on Google Classroom and using all the Google tools has definitely helped their virtual learning, made it a little bit easier for them.
Yeah, I mean, I think thank you for sharing that, Melissa. I mean, I was going to actually touch on something that probably is very related to the example you just shared. I think just generally, though, in a way, the experience over the last year was almost like a perfect test of like the underlying premise of cloud. That you'd have this planet scale sort of distributed infrastructure that could sort of be incredibly elastic and scalable, such that even really big new demands on IT could be met. And I think for the most part, the technology is stood up. I'll share two things, two examples. One is just around Google Meet. I mean, as you can imagine, like you said, because of all of the pressures of work from home, learn from home, businesses all of a sudden becoming 100% online, that was one of our products that was, the most affected by the pandemic. And some of the numbers just blow me away because there was a blog post where our sort of chief site reliability engineer for Google Meet shared that there was a 30x increase in demand in the beginning of this year for Meet, and that during the height of that demand, you had 100 million daily meeting participants. And that was certainly not something that was anticipated going into this year. She sort of recounts in a sort of vivid detail how the work that they had to do to get in front of that demand. With leveraging our global footprint, with putting in new changes to increase efficiencies, and to be able to handle that load. And the irony, as our CEO pointed out, is that they were doing all of this while going remote themselves. So it's kind of, it's quite meta. So that's sort of very vivid example in my mind from this last year about the sort of the role that technology and innovation played. Another, just because Usman brought up PPP, is just how everybody was just so driven to do their part in that, and for us, one thing that we really focused in on was as the demand, the loan volume was just through the roof, and I'm maybe Nicole can speak to this, but and then you started seeing all the backups in the industry, and we looked at that situation and we thought to ourselves, like, this is a situation where some of our technology, like document AI, really can help. And so we came up with a solution that we offered for free, to just allow automation to sort of supplement that intake process, and to really speed it up so that you could go from a period of many hours down to like minutes to process sort of standard loan documents. And that was one of the ways we thought of to try to just to help and to do what we could to make the situation better.
Yeah, anything that we can do to help everybody get adjusted to the new normal. Nicole, one of the panels we heard from earlier was about how one of the positives of the past year is the rise of and focus on the digital space. As the head of digital policy, I'm sure you've been very busy at Barclays. You want to share a little bit about your experience over the past year, but not only from a point of view of addressing COVID, but also, you're the European on the panel, and I know Usman and Banaz have talked a little bit about the PPP loans here in the U.S. I know there's been a number of initiatives in the European space too.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously COVID-19 has been a shock to everyone. It's not a crisis that has occurred from a specific sector. It's really demonstrated the wider impact that pandemics can have on all industries, regardless of the sector, and that the role of digital is just so important. And it's interesting because I travel quite a lot, so I'm not always in the office. But now you're seeing lots and lots of employees having to work remotely. That's obviously an increase in the use of digital. But your colleagues, and I've talked about the change of mindset, but they may not be totally tech savvy. So one of the things we've had to do is, training again internally and comms going out to explain to different employees how they can use different tools. And there's obviously been an increase in collaboration tools within the bank to make it easier to work from home. Now, it's interesting for Barclays because we've had to keep a number of our branches open, which makes sense because not all of our customers can use technology or want to use technology even if they could. But you have also found customers who could go to a branch but have decided understandably not to, which has led to a massive increase in our call centres. So that led to innovation in the chatbot domain. So we had to create a chatbot that would help with Q&A, so that people could be asking about payments and accounts, because you don't want to be holding on to the phone to your bank for 4 hours or 5 hours, and you want to get answers quickly. You're already, I'm guessing, stressed enough during this situation. So I think that was something that was really interesting. But also what I really liked, and it's actually outside of financial services, is as a bank, we were actually helping do things like hackathons and follow-on sessions with our National Health Service and with universities to look at responses to identified problems to help the NHS solve them using technology. And using our network, we actually helped find 3D printers in our Eagle Labs to help print parts of the PPE. So there's different angles that we've been involved in, and I think that's really important because you obviously have your sector, but within your sector you have a large network which helps other sectors, and we all have to come together and think outside the box during this time. So it's obviously been difficult for all, but it's also been great to see how everyone's coming together, how sectors are coming together, and how important but actually reliant digital can be. So those are the sort of things that we've been seeing at Barclays, and it's been a difficult time, and the loans obviously is something that we've also been focused on. But I think digital has definitely helped us get through what has been a turbulent time.
Yeah, I agree. I think the other focus that I'm glad you touched on was the focus of technology and innovation from a global point of view. I think if anything we've seen, right, you can't just assume, especially in the financial services space, this is only in the U.S. or this is only in the U.S.'s case, a specific state. I know that, Nicole, I know that you and others on the panel work very closely with global regulators in addressing technology and innovation. Can you share a little bit about your experience of working with regulators around the globe and any advice you have to regulators, in addressing new technologies?
So I think I've been really fortunate. I've worked in innovation policy for 6 years, which admittedly might not sound that long in certain jobs, but in innovation policy, it's a bit like dog years. It's actually a really long time. So I've been working on it even before FCA Innovate was created back in 2014. And I think what's really interesting, when I said about my distribution list internally, it's the same with policymakers in terms of the amount of policymakers that I would see 6 years ago compared to today has obviously vastly grown. And what's really interesting about innovation is it crosses borders in ways we haven't seen before. So the global aspect is so important. And I'm sure that you've heard this word used a lot during your series, that collaboration across industry is absolutely key. And when I talk about industry, I'm talking about wider industry. I'm not talking about established financial institutions just talking to each other. I'm talking about startups. I'm talking about the likes of Google and PayPal. I'm talking about the regulators, because the role of the regulator is absolutely essential. Because in order to be able to, I work for a regulated institution, so in order to be able to regulate, I need my regulators to have a regulatory landscape that is fit for purpose for what we're doing. So there are different ways we can do this. We have bilateral meetings. I think things like today are so excellent. And I say that I learn a lot, both as a participant and as an attendee. So I think they're great. One thing that you mentioned, the European aspect, one thing that I really applaud the European Commission for is, so about 2 years ago, they turned around and they said, you know what, we know that our framework may not be fit for purpose. And that's fair enough. That's not a criticism on the European landscape or any framework. It's that a lot of these regulations were written more than 20 years ago. And so I don't like to say new technologies, because I think I've mentioned them, but I said new technology to my mum once, and she turned around and said, but I've watched The Terminator and AI isn't new. And you go, you're right, Mum, AI isn't new, but the use of it within financial services and the use cases is new. So the Commission said, right, what we want to do is we want to pull in a load of industry experts. We're going to put out a call for input. You have to fill in your CV, then a cover letter, and we're going to sit down over 18 months to 2 years, and this group is going to put together a report which is going to tell us where there are gaps in our framework and where we could be doing more to promote innovation. And I think that's really valuable, because we do not expect our regulators to know the answers to everything. That's not your role. But we need you to work with the industry, which I know the CFTC does a lot of, particularly with CFTC Lab, in order to understand the use cases that you're going to regulate. So, within the UK, there's a number of public-private advisory groups. I sat on a digital sandbox advisory group for the FCA when they were creating a digital sandbox. And I think initiatives such as that, or another thing that the Europeans are doing, at the University of Florence, they had a course which was for regulators, and I went in to talk about the role of platformization, which was to then help educate a number of our regulators across the European Union. So it's all of those different things, and then looking at best practices in other jurisdictions. No one is going to be the best at everything, so it's looking at what you can do and what you can learn from other jurisdictions. I was so happy last year when I saw that the CFTC had joined the Global Financial Innovation Network, because I think that's another great way for regulators across the globe to be working with the industry, but together. So those sort of things that we've been doing, I'd say, over the last 6 years, but particularly over the last 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, it's great, and a great shout out to the Global Financial Innovation Network. We talked about it a little bit earlier on a regulator panel about the importance of collaboration amongst regulators to talk about these areas. Usman, I know you also have a very global role at PayPal, and anything you want to share from that perspective of working with global regulators, especially in the fintech world, not just traditional financial services?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. Thanks. So PayPal, available in 200 countries, and licensed and regulated in a variety of different ways. This whole concept of kind of regulatory cooperation in the financial services space, I think, has evolved massively over the last couple of decades, in large part due to the financial crisis, but there's always been kind of through the Basel committees like a way to coordinate. But I would say in the payment space, there's, especially in kind of the newer parts of the payments ecosystem or in the newer parts of the fintech ecosystem, there's certainly a lot more to be done, and very, very exciting, the CFTC's work and kind of through these innovation networks where there's a potential to kind of see some of that, collaboration across borders, because traditionally, and obviously, you've got different geopolitical tensions, you've got different histories, you've got different cultures, you've got different contexts in all of these countries, and so it's not surprising that regulators and policymakers in different countries want to implement in different ways. But what I'd say to folks from industry and to a certain extent to policymakers and regulators on the call is actually, like, from my perspective in my work on this over the years, the goals of, let's say the good industry actors and the policymakers and regulators are largely aligned. Like, we all want better, we all want more financial inclusion, we all want better financial health, we want, better functioning markets, we want, financial stability. Like, largely everybody who's, again, above board in the industry and in the regulatory sector agrees upon those things. And so that's, I think, sometimes we don't stop and take a second to take account of that. And I think it's important, because once you start from that positive baseline, then you can move towards places where there might be, minor or major disagreements, and have a really robust conversation and a data-based conversation about why certain rules might be made in a certain way. And so I've always found that, in almost every country around the world, just starting from that perspective, it's very rare that I can think of an example where a regulator isn't, willing and interested in wanting to engage and wanting to learn and wanting to debate, and I think that's healthy. There shouldn't be, just kind of, industry goes and does whatever it wants, or the regulators don't engage with industry. Neither of those is a good outcome. But from my experience, I think there's been a lot of positive developments. There's certainly a lot more to do, particularly in the international space, but the rules around fintech are just being made. So it's understandable that that we're kind of building the rail tracks or whatever while we're on the train. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, no, thanks for that insight. Behnaz, I want to turn a little bit to you about the data and technology piece of it, whether it be in working with global regulators. Obviously there's a big focus of privacy and aspect of that, but also as you combine data with AI, machine learning, cloud, and you can see how and where the technology and innovation can kind of get all of us to the next level. Can you share a little bit about some of the experience that Google has had around the globe in working with regulators on these initiatives, but also where you see the role that data and technology can play in overall, but also especially in the financial services industry?
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. That's a great question. Somebody said recently in a roundtable that I was at that there is a gap between data and information. And data is plentiful. I mean, in fact, one of the main challenges that we have is really sort of trying to get our arms around data. It's information that is really valuable. That's where the value is created. And just to give you an example, so I was just looking up some statistics, and there's a World Economic Forum infographic that said by 2025, we are going to be creating 463 exabytes of data daily globally, which is like the equivalent of apparently 213 million DVDs per day. So, to the point about the gap between data and information, the real issue is how do you get from this vast amount of data to something that is actually actionable? And to me, one of the central roles of technology is to bridge that gap, right? And you see it in so many different spaces, but I think some of the areas that are most promising that I've talked a lot to recently include things like RegTech and SubTech. In financial services, the cost of compliance for businesses in the financial services sector are not going down. In fact, they're going up, and they're going up significantly. And similarly, for regulators, the stakes that are involved, whether it's stopping fraud or preventing criminals from being able to launder ill-gotten gains, those stakes have never been higher. So I think given that background, given the high cost and compliance, the stakes involved, I think increasingly you are going to see businesses turn to technology to help them draw signals from the noise, to make sense of data, and to be able to do what they have to do under the law better. So that's one space that we're focused heavily on. Another is regulatory reporting. There again, you I think see a system now where it's incredibly manual. It's incredibly you're getting a snapshot in time, and so there are limits to the usefulness of the information that you're getting from industry, and huge demands, from cost and from resources that industry has to put into maintaining those systems. I think increasingly you're going to see both regulators and industry asking, what more can we do? How can this go from just being a purely reporting situation to being one where kind of more of a platform-based system where you're drawing more insights from that data at the same time that you're doing, surveillance. And you're building sort of an ecosystem for all of the players that are involved on those kinds of issues. So anyway, that's sort of what I think is the sort of the direction of travel, and where I think technology is going to be able to really to make some real differences.
Yeah, regulatory reporting and what regulators do, or how we look at the data, I think is definitely something focus for here at the Commission. About a couple weeks ago, we just announced our new division of data and a new division of technology to highlight the importance and emphasis on these areas, both internally and then externally as we move forward. I think for all of the listeners and for all of you, there'll be more to come as these divisions get set up and what their missions and goals are for sure. But as you can see with that one reorg was trying to send a message that there is an importance here in that space for sure. Nicole, how about from a Barclays perspective, the role of data and technology and what you see for that in the future?
I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I mean, data is just so important for innovation. We often hear phrases like data is the new oil. I mean, I move away from that partly from a sustainability perspective, but also just from oil is finite and data is not. So I like to think of it as a renewable energy source. And it's so important. I mean, we touched on regulatory reporting. I've seen some statistics, Richard. I think it was from 2008 to 2016, there was a 500% increase in regulatory change. And then when we're looking about how much RegTech spend has happened, I think in 2017 it was like 10.6 billion, but it's anticipated to be 76.3 billion in 2022 because there's so much regulatory change and the regulatory environment is just ever more complex. I mean, I don't want to keep throwing out stats, but I read somewhere that by the end of this year, there would be 300 million pages of regulatory documents which had been published. I mean, that is, I don't say it's impossible for people, groups of people to read that much, but it's definitely much easier with technology. So things like regulatory reporting, I think back to the tech sprint, which I know the CFTC participated in last year when we could do things in person. In the UK, we had an AML and fin crime tech sprint where we were looking at the role of technology and data to help prevent fin crime. So it's all of those sort of angles that we've been heavily focused on as well. And I think it's really important to the industry and our customers. It's not Barclays specific. And I think that's what's so interesting about RegTech and a lot of these matters. These are not things that are specific to Barclays or to Google or to PayPal. It's things that are necessary for the industry at large. So we all need to be working on them together. And we're very cognizant of that.
Yeah. Usman, how about from a PayPal perspective? And if you can touch a little bit on, from the point of view of your customers, the value that data and technology can help for them as well, not just from a company perspective.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you for kind of tilting it towards that direction. I think that's, exactly the kind of traditional core offering, again, of PayPal, this kind of online payments product. The reason the customer for us, the people pay us money, is like businesses. And what they were getting value out of was that their fraud was going way down because, again, credit cards or checks, but also just, being able to hack into a merchant's database and kind of pull out a bunch of information. And just having that, the ability for fraudsters to get at these businesses go way down was a huge data-based innovation that benefited the online ecosystem. And now you've seen kind of over the last year, e-commerce just take off beyond belief. But beyond that, I'd say, data is in the financial services ecosystem is leveraged, I would say, a good deal for fraud reduction. We've heard about customer service and bots from Nicole, but also, the creation of new products. I think that's another big part of data, is being able to understand the customer problem more deeply and say, hey, again, in the case of PayPal, hey, the number one customer pain point for our businesses was access to finance. So let's partner with banks and set up a way for them to get loans. And that's kind of how we got into this whole Paycheck Protection Program thing. But, I think when it comes to the regulatory piece of this, Nicole throws out some staggering numbers. I think there's some really interesting thinking going on, and we wrote a paper almost, I want to say it was like 7 or 8 years ago at this point, around this concept of database dynamic performance standards was, the dorky term that we put on it. But, Corey Stone and Todd Baker out of Columbia have just written a paper on kind of measuring financial health or measuring outcomes as a way to think about regulatory structures. And, it's a very interesting concept that I hope people continue to think about. I understand the need for certainty and the need for clarity and rules, but, industry has long called for risk-based approaches and approaches that kind of, understand that certain innovations actually decrease risk. And that's a good thing, and you should want to encourage that, but certain innovations certainly increase. And so understanding the outcome or the performance or whatever term you want to call it of the actual regulated entity is a very interesting approach. I know it's challenging, and I understand the complexity of it, but it's certainly worth considering when you hear about the number of pages and the complexity of trying to implement all of that, particularly when it comes to really high growth small startups or that kind of innovation where it would be very difficult to intake that level of information and comply with it.
Could I just quickly pick up on something that Usman said about the product side? And I totally agree. We have to look at what's good for our customers and from a product perspective as well. And that to me always leads to quite a nice conversation about data sharing, because when we're talking about the role of data It's how much data do you have, which can also be very important, and how you use that data. And I think one thing that I found really interesting during the COVID-19 pandemic is, in the past, you may have found consumers and investors being nervous about how their data is being shared. And I would naturally not want my healthcare data to be shared. You now see telcos sharing with healthcare and vice versa. So for me, I think it's really important that there is some sort of framework. If I was to give advice to a policymaker, it would be have a look at the data sharing frameworks or their lack of, and see what you can put in place, because ultimately that will result in better things for our consumers all round. So I just wanted to pick up on that point.
That's a great point. And, in light of the pandemic, of course, right before today, I just signed up for the Maryland notification that you're in this window for COVID. Are you engaged with somebody in the window and thinking about how the data of knowing where I was and somebody else was there and had it, and how that could impact my health, but my family's health as well, especially as we go into the U.S. holiday of Thanksgiving, I think is definitely very important. You talk a little bit about those millions of pages of regulatory text, which is very scary even as a regulator to hear and to say. But at the end of the day, too, in addition to that, regulation does move a lot slower than technology itself. I'm hopeful that Lab CFTC, and we talked about GFIN and the 60+ regulators that have innovation offices or innovation agendas around the world, right, that all of us are moving more toward recognizing what Usman said, right, in the sense of, hey, sometimes innovation still is solving our problem, and maybe not in the traditional way that we're used to. But Nicole, I know obviously in working with financial regulators, and obviously you know the FDA well, but also they were the leader in setting up GFIN. What advice, as regulators continue to embark on setting up these innovation offices, but also as offices like mine that have been around for 3 years now, as we continue to engage, what advice do you have for us on innovation mindset?
So just taking your first point about regulation moving slower than technology, I mean, in fairness, it's understandable, and it's also necessary, because what you don't want, or what I personally would not want, is for a regulator to make a knee-jerk reaction to something, and then you've got some regulation that isn't future-proof and is actually going to hinder innovation. Because there's a very fine line between it. But I think back to, obviously there's a GFIN, but I think back to, again, last year when we were able to travel and move around. I was at something called the EFIF, which is the European Forum for Innovation Facilitators. And I'd say maybe 3 years ago, I presented at the EBA, and we were talking about innovation labs in different jurisdictions. And there were a lot of European jurisdictions who are like, we're not so comfortable with these, we're not comfortable with sandboxes. And you roll over, forward 3 years, you're sat in this meeting with policymakers from across the different member states, and you're hearing how many of them have either set up innovation labs or are about to set up innovation labs. So I think that's a really nice shift that I've seen. In terms of advice, so I guess it goes partly to the lab and also to just general advice. So technology neutrality, obviously very important. I don't want to say that it's not, because if you make a regulation which is focused solely on a technology, that's probably going to cause you a problem down the line. You're not future-proofing it. But I do think that when you're creating a regulatory framework, you have to think about that technology. So I'm going to give you an example, and this is no slight on the general data protection regulation. It's just using it as an example. So I'm sure that you're all aware of the GDPR, because even though it's an EU regulation, it's extraterritorial. So in the US, you're still caught by it. Now, I'm often asked by some of my European counterparts, why is it that things like AI and innovation doesn't always move as quickly or as far as, for instance, in other jurisdictions? And you'll start to think it's because there's a real tension between data protection and innovation. And that's because when the GDPR was put out, whilst tech neutrality is obviously one of its key focus areas, they haven't necessarily thought about the technology as much as you would hope. So, for instance, you may or may not be able to put personal data onto the blockchain. But that's going to cause you a problem also in your lab, because if you're working with people who want to put personal data onto the blockchain, they're going to try and go, well, actually, can I do it? And if I can't, am I having to think about something else? AI experimentation is another good example where the GDPR may cause you challenges due to different principles. So I would give that as one piece of advice. Think about the technology and the use case when you're putting out your framework. Collaboration we've mentioned is really, really important. One other thing that I actually think is really valuable, or two actually. So I know that the FCA, for instance, are about to get a director of technology within the regulator. I think that's great. But they've also done secondment outside of the regulator into private sector institutions. So we've had some people from the FCA actually come and work at our RISE accelerator. And that's great because it goes back to you're working really closely with the private sector and you're seeing, daily the challenges that we're seeing from the framework that we're working within. Because within a lab, it's only for a set period. Sometimes, it might be a 6-month pilot, it might be a 3-month pilot, it might be a 9-month pilot. But I think if you're and you're only going to meet every now and then, but if you're literally sat in the Barclays RISE every day for a year, you're going to see things that you might not necessarily have seen otherwise. But I have to say, I really applaud what the CFTC has been doing in terms of CFTC labs, joining GFIN, all of these events. I think they're so valuable, both for yourselves, but for the industry at large.
Behnaz, how about your perspective, not only in terms of what advice you have to us and fellow regulators in the innovation offices. But let's talk a second, too, about the role of startups and innovators, right? I mean, Google and PayPal and Barclays are pretty large companies, whether you've been around for 300 years or 20 years or 30 years, right? You're very large when and compared to, the true startups of the world. So have any advice, not only from a regulatory point of view, but also to startups and innovators in terms of working with regulators?
Yeah, definitely. I'll start with the first question. I mean, I think it's such a great question because the recurring issue that I find with regulation in the technology space is how to find the right balance between specificity on the one hand and timelessness or maybe tech neutrality, different sort of generalness on the other. And I'll say, I absolutely agree with what Nicole said, and I think Usman sort of hinted at it earlier, that you don't want to lock things in. Absolutely agree with that. I think we have some examples in the financial services space of rules that were very, very good and forward-leaning when they were put in place, like SEC 1784, but then quickly sort of got outmoded when technology shifted. But on the other hand, sometimes, clarity and specificity can be really helpful. I was listening to a really interesting interview with Brian Brooks from the OCC, where he said, especially in a sort of a risk-averse environment like the financial services sector, if there is silence or uncertainty, the natural inclination of the industry is to be overly conservative. Whereas what we really want is for the industry to be optimally conservative. And so in instances like that, there is sometimes a real value to having guidance and from having clarity. And I don't really have it necessarily, I don't think I have a great answer to propose, but I think there's some things that may help find the right balance between those poles. And some of them I think the other speakers sort of touched on already. One is sort of being really clear about the objectives, what one hopes to gain, because that may be an easier thing to adapt to shifting technology. Two, I think Usman mentioned was, really to try to be risk-based as much as possible. Because again, if you are risk-based, our interests are entirely aligned. I think both, all of the participants, industry, technology providers, regulators, all have a shared interest in mitigating risk. And then the third, is again, maintaining that really, really close collaboration between all the industry participants to try to sort of navigate a fast-shifting landscape. So that's my advice. I'll stop there just to let Usman have a whack at the question. He may have some good ideas for the startups.
Well, Usman, she teed you up. She made my job easier.
Thank you. Yeah.
Talk about collaboration. There you go.
There you go. No, so I mean, look, let me circle back to, I guess, where we started this whole concept of an innovation mindset, and I think Nicole and Benaz have laid out a number of aspects of regulatory reform or regulatory best practice that I think could be couched as within the concept of innovation, right? In terms of collaboration, in terms of having some flexibility, in terms of offering a risk-based approach. Like, I think those are a lot of things that you could just wholesale take into the private sector innovation landscape, and you'd be talking about the same thing. One thing that I think is difficult and needs to be thought through is, imagine if we were still using the Google algorithm from 1997. It probably wouldn't be a great service, right? They make like 2,000 changes a year or 3,000 changes to the algorithm like a year. PayPal in a similar, like if you still had the PayPal button from 1998, I don't think it would be that great of a service today. So my point is innovation is not just some one-time thing, right? It's a constantly iterating, evolving process. And again, I want to agree with Benaz, like clarity is incredibly important. But finding that balance where it's not a rule that's locked in for 20 years and then the world is a completely different place, that's finding some kind of middle ground between those 2 points, I think is a very important concept for achieving some kind of regulatory success. And I know for the startups, I know the answer has been kind of this sandbox environment, which Nicole I'm sure can speak to in great detail, and I don't necessarily have criticisms of it, but what I just say is it's certainly not something that can be scaled, right? So like you can only live in a sandbox for a little while until you get big enough that there probably needs to be. Or the other piece from the sandbox is, can you make adjustments to the broader pieces of regulation based upon what you learn from the sandbox? I think those are the key questions or learnings from a sandbox. So I think it was trying to bring these two things together is a little difficult, but I'd say when it comes to the startups and kind of their regulatory oversight, I think back to my earlier point where if they have their mission and mindset aligned, I'm hopeful that that with some of these regulatory approaches that are collaborative, that are innovation driven, that we can see some really exciting new startups in this space.
I personally love a sandbox, despite the fact there is no sand in it, which is quite disappointing when you first go into it for a regulator, because I understand what you're saying in terms of scalability, but I think that can be solved if you have a longer sandbox project where the European Commission is looking at a pilot regime. We've actually been in Barclays in a couple of sandboxes, and when we've worked with startups, I give them two pieces of advice. One is always seek permission rather than forgiveness. I can tell you that seeking forgiveness from a financial service regulator is not a situation that you should want to be in. But also, don't think about where your company is today. Think about what you want your company to end up as and build for that. So if there isn't regulation for you now, but you think there is going to be regulation, build with that in mind, and that's how I think about it. But yeah, I'm a big fan of the sandbox, though I do understand the.
I think we're in agreement.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would just say I think we can do a whole panel on just sandboxes and our viewpoint on sandboxes. I know I had actually a European regulator and colleague share with me, a lot of the connotation of sandboxes is there's a bunch of kids playing in the sand and just throwing sand at each other. But the true purpose of a sandbox, and I love this regulator's quote, was that the true purpose of the sandbox is exactly like you want with your kids playing in the sandbox, that there are teachers making sure that they're not throwing sand in somebody else's face, right? And only helping them learn what they need to learn in order to behave outside of the sandbox. And that's my 2 cents on sandboxes, and definitely something that I think regulators around the globe are looking at for sure. Unfortunately, we're at time, but I want to thank all of you for the great panel and the great discussion. It's always great seeing all of you, but also sharing and talking through the innovation mindset that each of you bring to the table. Really appreciate the strong partnership here and everything you do. Also want to just say thank you to the Lab CFTC staff and all of the people who helped facilitate today. And so with that, I will turn this back over to Siobhan to close us out for the day. Thanks again.